planned on making this video, and I'm not exactly sure where I'm going with it yet. I wanted to capture a real life experience that I'm going through right now. And if not for viewership, maybe just for my own records, my own experiences, my own journey. I think it's worth talking about, and I don't think this is my experience alone. I have a suspicion that someone else probably can relate to this in some way. So back in 2016, I was married. And after 2 years, we filed for divorce. And in that marriage, I took my then husband's last name. And pretty soon after we married, I took our marriage license. And when you marry someone here, at least in British Columbia, you can assume their name. So this is pretty much the only time where you can change your name without a legal name process. And I'll talk more about what a legal name process is later, but essentially it was as easy as me going into my banks, going to my cell phone company, calling the CRA, and just either showing them in person the marriage license and my birth certificate, or some people needed me to scan it in, they needed records, they needed copies of it. It was pretty easy. And at the time, my main reason for changing my name wasn't so much about taking my husband's name. Like, I don't know that I feel super passionate about that construct. I'm not against it, but it's just not something I have strong feelings on one way or the other. But I have had a hyphenated or a double-barreled last name my whole life. So I took both my mom and my dad's last names because they weren't married at the time of my birth, and they actually never ended up staying together after I was about 1 year old. So it was important to both of them that I had each of their names. In the process of changing my name back in 2016, I couldn't find my birth certificate. And that was a big panic at the time. That's like the one document you don't even really know how you got it, and you know you're not supposed to lose it. Anyways, I don't even remember what it involved getting a new one, but I got a new one in the mail. When our marriage ended, we went through the whole divorce and were legally divorced. Because it had only been 2 years since we were married, I still was feeling like I was like, I just changed my name. I wasn't quite ready to go and do all that again in reverse and go back to my maiden name. So up until this year, 2023, I have just kept my ex-husband's last name, and there was no animosity. There was no real emotion that I held with this name. If anything, it was just aesthetically pleasing, and it was straightforward. One first name, one last name. Marrying Brian really started to change my relationship with my name. And it was important to me that I enter that marriage with my maiden name. So we asked if I could have my maiden name on our marriage license. And what we learned is that my maiden name was still my legal last name, because when you take your husband's name, you're assuming their name. You're not actually changing your legal name. And on the marriage license, either spouse can go by either one of the names. So technically, Brian could assume my last name just as easily as I could assume his name. So we were married, and our marriage license has my maiden name, the 2 last names. And that was the Kickstarter for me beginning to go back to my maiden name. And I'd just been putting it off at this point. Like, I'd thought about going back during the pandemic. Like, that was kind of when I was having these thoughts. And at that time, like, places were closed. I couldn't go in, or it was a lot more complicated to book appointments. And honestly, it was just a pain, and I just put it off and put it off. Now with things being open again and being married to Brian, I just thought this was the time. I was ready to invest the energy into changing my name back. So I started with the easy ones. The bank, my employer, my cell phone company, my internet service provider. Once you start writing a list, you realize that you have a lot of logins. I was also attacking a new email address at the same time, because my email address was my first and last name with my married name. And so I wanted to slowly phase out that email as well. So with every account, I was changing my last name and I was changing my email address. I got pretty far until I had to go to ICBC, which is our our DMV. They take care of driver's licensing, our health card. They issue photo ID. So I go to ICBC last week. I had made an appointment for a name change, and I provided them with my new birth certificate. And just as a side note, I had actually found my original birth certificate. I didn't bring it with me, but I did have it. So I go with my new birth certificate, and the woman is looking at my birth certificate and is telling me that she has to put my name as exactly as it is on my birth certificate on my driver's license. And so she was clarifying. She's like, okay, so this is your last name. And when I was looking at this new birth certificate, I was realizing that they had categorized my names. So on one line was my given names. So that was my first name, my 2 middle names, and one of my last names. And then on the second line said surname, and it had my second last name. So this woman was saying that she was only gonna put this one last name as my last name. And I was like, oh, no. Sorry, there must just been like a mistake. This is my last name, and this is my last name. I have 2 last names. And she's like, not according to this, you don't. According to this, you have a first name, 3 middle names, and 1 last name. And I was just like, oh, come on, this is just a clerical error. This is just, they put it on the wrong line. And she had a legal obligation to mirror the birth certificate identically. So I left without having changed anything. I then phoned Vital Statistics and said, there's been a mistake. You've listed one of my last names as a middle name, and I'd like you to fix that. So the man on the phone was pretty sympathetic, but at the end of the day, he said, this is not your last name. This has always been your middle name, and you've only ever had 1 last name. And I'm like, you're wrong. I have been Corie Potter Loudon my entire life. Potter Loudon have been my last names my entire life. And he's like, no, they haven't. Potter has always been your middle name. So I wasn't settling for this. I was in disbelief, and I still was fairly certain there had been an error on their end. So they actually scanned and sent me my birth registry, the form that my mom filled out when I was born. And on that form, she had listed Potter Loudon as my last names and had scribbled out Potter and initialed and added Potter to one of my given names. And when I called my mom to ask her about this, she said that at my time of birth, at the time of registering my birth, they didn't allow her to list two last names. And in order to have two last names, they would have to be legally hyphenated, which they're not. So she said, in order to still honor her maiden name, Potter, she just stuck it in as a middle name. So technically, since my time of birth, Potter has always been my middle name and Loudon has always been my last name. And so I was like, okay, well, how has it been 36 years and I'm just figuring this out now? And so I went back and I looked at my original birth certificate, the one I had lost and then found, and it's just a small little piece of paper, and across the top in one line, no commas, nothing, it just says my 5 names. So if you can imagine, like, I've been using that as my primary source of ID to get all my other ID my entire life. And so when they are looking at the line, they're saying, what's your last name? And I've just been saying Potter Loudon, Potter Loudon, Potter Loudon. And there was no way of knowing that Potter has always legally been one of my middle names. So there's a side of me that's just like, it's just a piece of paper. It doesn't matter. People know my name. But it's getting increasingly complicated. So I went back to ICBC today and I'm like, you know what? I'm playing by your rules. As it, like, you know, with what I have now, like, unless I want to go through a legal name change, which I don't know a whole lot about the entire process, but it costs money. It's just annoying. So unless I wanted to do that, like, I'm working with the chips I've been dealt, cards I've been dealt, hand I've been dealt. I've just found acceptance and like, okay, Potter's my middle name, Loudon's my last name. Like, we can work with that. I can still write Potter Loudon on everything unless it's a legal document. I need to put them in separate categories. So I'm back and I'm like, okay, you were right. Let's just get this ball rolling. I asked, are you able to write all my middle names on my driver's license? And she's looking at them and she's like, oh, no, you're only technically allowed 4 names on your driver's license. So Potter will be cut. And Potter is the only one I really want. On all of the banking, my social security number, like everything else, I have listed Potter Loudon as my last names. And now on my photo ID, Potter isn't even there. Right now, as it stands, my driver's license and my health card have me listed as Corie Loudon. My social insurance number, Corie Potter Loudon. My passport is still my ex's name. All my banking information is Potter Loudon. And I am just feeling so like my identity, and not who I am, but like who I am, feels so scattered. And it feels like everything requires an explanation. Like nothing is simple. And I was doing this as a way of simplifying things, like going back to my maiden name, like just like clearing the slate, starting fresh, So that when Brian and I decide, like, if I'm going to take his last name, it's kind of from a place of like eliminating my previous marriage altogether. Like, there's no little bits and pieces of that. It's like me, who I was when I was born, making that decision. The most chaotic part of it is the fact that, like, it would be way easier for me to just change to Brian's name. Like that. Like, boom, easy. One piece of paper, marriage license, boom, change it. It's been really hard to not feel, I get emotional thinking about it. There's a loss of control. There have been these moments where I don't feel like I'm the expert of my own experience, of my own identity. And there's all this bureaucracy, all this red tape, all these rules, all these parameters that we need to follow, we need to fit within, we need to comply with. And I understand that there's a safety component, and a lot of this is based around safety, my safety. I don't want to take that for granted. I don't want to not acknowledge that these systems are complicated because life is complicated, but it has been such a head trip, and it's consumed a lot of my time and energy. And I haven't really been treated very well throughout the process. Like, not unwell, but just like, I'm the inconvenience. I'm complicated. Or also like, this shouldn't be a big deal. Don't worry about it. It's just a name. It's just a piece of paper. It feels bigger than that. So Brian and I were talking today, and like, we have this visa application. Like, I'm applying for permanent residency to live in the United States, and my identity is such a mess. And I don't imagine that Homeland Security's gonna love that. So there is some fear that there will be an impact on our application, just in that it's complicated. You know, it's like, who are you? What is this mess? So that's a bit of a worry. There is that. We were talking about me taking his name today. And that's what I'm leaning towards now, is just being a united front with Brian and getting rid of all these names. Like, I guess I would be Corie Louise Potter Coleman. Can't get rid of that Potter now. It's like, I want it now, but I don't want, it's crazy. So there's no real solution to this yet. I'm just in it. I've ordered my new ID, and we'll see when that comes if I decide to go with Brian's name. It's crazy how complicated it is. You know, and the other side of me is like, well, do I just go through a legal name change? And that just seems like, I feel a moral opposition to paying. Like, if I had just used my original birth certificate all of this time, none of this would be happening. Had I just used the piece of ID that had all my names on one line, this wouldn't be happening, because it didn't. Before I was married, I had 2 last names on my driver's license, and they just took my word. It's a weird thing. And you know, the move and just feeling like this feels a little more urgent because I'm applying to move to the States and just trying to like clean up my shit. Like, no loose ends. I just want things to feel clean and uncomplicated. Go figure. I've gone and complicated everything. So that's where we're at. I really do oscillate between being really overwhelmed and emotional about it and just laughing and being like, what a life. We have just complicated this life, and I want to be mindful that I'm not overcomplicating my thoughts and my energy. That's it. So yes, maybe this struck a chord. Maybe you relate to this in some way, and if you do, I would love to chat with you in the comments section. And if you have any sage advice, any wise words, I could definitely use those as well. So thank you. Talk to you next time. It is now March 3rd, and I think enough time has passed for the emotions to have subsided quite a bit since my original video. And it's not that I feel any type of resolution, but I have had enough time to just accept the circumstances and accept the complexity of it. It's unique in a sense, and it's also an experience that I imagine people have gone through in a variety of different capacities. It's part of the frustration with these governing bodies that do hold quite a lot of power over our lives, our names, our identities. From a wide lens, we are a statistic. We're a name, we're a number. So I do think those systems discount the personal experience living within those systems. And I know people are just doing their jobs. And there's no intention of shaming or complaining or calling out any of these agencies. It's just really, I was wanting to highlight this really weird experience where I've thought one thing my entire life, and 36 years later, I learned something else. I also wanted to add that the changing of my email address at the same time was my panicked approach to regaining order and control of my life. I got it in my head that I was getting rid of this former married name, and I really was acting with a sense of urgency. My biggest takeaway from this is to move slow and intentionally, and you don't have to have everything figured out all at once. The reality of changing my email address at the same time has actually caused more complications, just more complexities, an added layer of confusion. So it's like people don't know what to call me and don't know where to reach me. So that was maybe a hard lesson. The other complexity that I didn't mention because I hadn't experienced it yet, but I probably shouldn't have started with my bank, mostly because my payroll, like the money I get from my job, that's been a little bit of a clunky wheel because the name on your paycheck has to match your banking institution. All of my e-transfers have been a little bit complicated because I changed my email, and I think it was just too much too fast. That's my big lesson there. Also, it's worth mentioning, you can start your name change And you don't have to necessarily have it changed everywhere. I just got way ahead of myself, like I already sort of explained. It's okay if a certain rewards account has you by a different name, or those emails are going into your old email address. Like, I think that if I were to do this all over again, I would have started with ICBC because they issue my photo ID, and I would have taken more time with that decision. I am leaning still towards changing my name to Brian's last name, and in retrospect, it would have been okay for me to go to one married name to another married name. And I think that really boils down to my ego and feeling a certain level of judgment towards myself. And that's something I'm still unpacking, and I'm not judging myself in this moment about it. That's just the reality. There was a reality that I had to face when ending a marriage and then deciding to go into another marriage. And ultimately, those were the two best decisions I've ever made. And I don't want to carry any shame around that. And I don't think I do in most ways, but I know that shame kind of reared its head when it came to going from one man's name to another. And that's just the honest truth. It's a weird thing, and I think, it's something that a lot of women, I imagine, can relate to. And there is this weird social expectation that we will take our partner's names and abandon our maiden name. And I think that was a layer of the emotion you saw, was just like, why is it so difficult to go back to like me, like to recenter? And it's so easy to take my husband's name. So there's work to be done. And I just, I really appreciate you holding space for this video and for the emotion I showed. And like I said earlier, if this at all resonated with you, and maybe you've had some similar experiences, I really would love to have that conversation and hear your experiences, and maybe you have some words of wisdom to share with me. So please, if you took anything away from this video, even if you just like hearing me ramble on and on, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. I am really excited about putting more energy into my YouTube channel, and all the support I can get would just be so helpful and so appreciated. So thank you, and I'll see you next time.